Welcome to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into a really significant and much talked about work in political science, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen M. Walt.
That's right. It started as a working paper, then became a full book in 2007, and it really tackles this fundamental question about the U.S.-Israel relationship. Why is it so consistently strong?
Exactly. And our mission today, for you listening, is to unpack their core arguments, look at the evidence they bring forward, and, understand the controversies that really blew up around this book.
It's certainly influential, even if contentious.
Definitely. So let's get started. What's the absolute central claim Mearsheimer and Walt are making here?
Okay, so the core argument is basically this, that the huge amount of U.S. support for Israel, we're talking economic aid, military stuff, diplomatic backing, political alignment, it's primarily because of the influence of what they call the Israel Lobby. Yeah. They argue it's not mainly about shared strategic interests or, common moral values, which are the usual explanations.
Right, the traditional reasons given. And they don't really pull any punches on this, do they? I remember a quote that really lays it out.
Oh, absolutely. They've stated it very directly. Let me see if I have it here. Yes. The overall thrust of U.S. policy in the region, they write, is due primarily to domestic politics and especially to the activities of the Israel Lobby. And they go on. Other special interest groups have managed to skew U.S. foreign policy in directions they favored, but no lobby has managed to divert U.S. foreign policy as far from what the American national interest would otherwise suggest.
Wow. That's a pretty strong claim. It sets the stage for their whole argument.
It really does. It's the foundation.
So they're directly challenging those standard explanations. Let's dig into those. What about this strategic interest argument? The idea that Israel is a key U.S. ally strategically.
Well, Mearsheimer and Walt argue that, maybe Israel was strategically valuable during the Cold War, a counterweight to Soviet influence. But they contend that value really decreased afterwards. And especially post 9/11, they argue that the unwavering U.S. support has actually become a strategic liability.
A liability? How so?
They say it complicates things like efforts to fight terrorism, dealing with Iran, promoting democracy in the region, achieving overall stability. They see the close alignment as hindering, not helping, those broader U.S. goals now.
Okay, that definitely pushes back against the common narrative.
Yeah.
What about the other big one, shared values? Democracies, Judeo-Christian heritage, that sort of thing.
They acknowledge that. They recognize Israel's democratic nature, especially in its neighborhood, and the historical context. But they argue the moral case for unconditional support is undermined by Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. They point specifically to the occupation, settlement building, human rights concerns. And they also suggest the U.S. isn't always consistent in applying human rights standards, maybe tougher on adversaries than on allies like Israel. That inconsistency, they say, weakens the moral argument.
Right. So if it's not primarily strategy or values driving this, according to them, then who or what is this Israel lobby? Or are they saying it's like one group pulling strings?
No, they're very careful about that.
Yeah.
They stress it's not some kind of unified conspiracy. Instead, they describe it as a powerful but kind of diffuse interest group. It's a network of individuals and organizations.
The network, okay.
Yeah, and it includes both Jewish and non-Jewish people and groups. What ties them together, even if they disagree on other stuff, is this shared goal of influencing U.S. policy in ways they see as benefiting Israel.
And do they name names, like specific organizations within this network?
They do. They identify AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as probably the most powerful and well-known. But they also mention others, like the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the ADL, the ZOA, Israel Policy Forum. And importantly, they also include think tanks in this. Places like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, AEI, Brookings Sabin Center. These places, they argue, play a big role in shaping policy ideas.
It sounds like a pretty wide-ranging coalition they're describing.
It is, and they make a point of including Christian evangelical groups who are often very strong supporters of Israel for their own theological reasons.
Right.
Plus neoconservative commentators, sympathetic media figures, some academics. It's a broad church, so to speak, united on this one issue.
Now, this is obviously a sensitive topic. How do the authors handle the potential charge of anti-Semitism? Because that came up a lot.
It did, and they address it head on. They explicitly reject any anti-Semitic intent. They emphasize repeatedly that they're critiquing a political lobby, its actions, its influence, not Jewish people as a group, or Judaism as a religion.
Okay, that distinction is key.
Yes. They frame it as, standard interest group politics, something common in American democracy. Their critique is about the perceived level of success this particular lobby has had and the consequences of that success for U.S. policy.
Right. They acknowledge the sensitivity, but insist it's a legitimate area for political analysis.
Exactly. They see it as analyzing how influence works in Washington.
So how does this influence actually work, according to Mearsheimer and Walt? What are the mechanisms they identify?
They lay out several key ways. One major one is electoral politics and campaign finance, basically mobilizing voters who care about this issue and directing campaign donations. They argue the lobby is very effective at rewarding politicians who support its agenda and, conversely, punishing those who criticize Israel.
And they give examples of that, right? Politicians who supposedly paid a price.
Yes, they mention figures like Paul Finley, Charles Percy, Earl Hilliard. They suggest these politicians face serious, well-funded opposition after taking stances seen as critical of Israel. There's also that quote they use from a former AIPAC official, Douglas Bloomfield, calling AIPAC the 800-pound gorilla in Washington, which, gives a sense of the perceived power.
The 800-pound gorilla? Yeah, that paints a picture. So it's about influencing elections. What else?
Another huge area is shaping public discourse, controlling the narrative, essentially. They argue the lobby works very hard to promote a positive image of Israel, respond aggressively to criticism, and sort of marginalize dissenting voices.
How do they do that? Through
things like monitoring media coverage, sometimes pressuring news outlets, organizing campaigns against critics, whether they're academics, journalists, or filmmakers.
So trying to police the boundaries of acceptable debate.
That's the implication. They cite controversies around academics like Norman Finkelstein and Tony Judt, campaigns against documentaries, challenges to professors getting tenure if they're seen as too critical of Israel.
Okay, so influencing elections, shaping public debate. What about direct influence on the government itself, like the White House or State Department?
That's the third pillar, really, direct influence on the executive branch. They suggest this happens by getting sympathetic people into key policy jobs, building close relationships with decision makers, and also working through Congress to pressure or constrain the administration.
Right, using Congress as leverage against the White House sometimes.
Exactly, and mobilizing public opinion to pressure administrations, too. They point to historical examples, like the fight over the AUSCS sale to Saudi Arabia under Reagan or the loan guarantee clashes under George H.W. Bush. They also analyze how the U.S. approached various peace process initiatives, arguing the lobby's influence often tilted the U.S. towards acting more like, quote, Israel's lawyer than an impartial mediator.
Israel's lawyer. That's a strong phrase. And you mentioned think tanks earlier. How do they fit into this direct influence picture?
They see think tanks as crucial for generating the intellectual ammunition, the policy papers, the arguments that support a pro-Israel stance. They highlight the founding of places like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, explicitly started by former AIPAC people, to provide that kind of analysis.
So creating a supportive echo chamber in the policy world.
Well, creating a source of readily available, expert-sounding arguments that align with the lobby's goals. They quote the authors saying, "These think tanks share an unshakable commitment to defending Israel's actions and supporting U.S. aid, even if they differ on details."
Got it. The book uses specific case studies to show this lobby in action. The Iraq War is a really prominent one. What's their take there?
Yeah, the Iraq War chapter is probably one of the most debated. Their argument is that the lobby, particularly the neoconservatives within it who had strong pro-Israel ties, was a crucial force pushing for the 2003 invasion. They're careful to say it wasn't the only factor, but they argue the war might not have happened without the lobby's influence.
And they point to specific individuals in the Bush administration.
Right. People like Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Faith, Richard Pearl, many linked to the Project for a New American Century, who were advocating for regime change in Iraq well before 9/11, often linking it to Israeli security.
And AIPAC's role.
They suggest AIPAC lobbied quietly for the war authorization in Congress. They quote former AIPAC director Howard Corr, calling that quiet lobbying one of their successes.
Okay, what about policy towards Iran? How do they see the lobby's influence there?
On Iran, they argue the lobby has consistently pushed for a much more confrontational U.S. stance, prioritizing tough sanctions, emphasizing military options, being skeptical of diplomacy, basically mirroring Israel's view of Iran as the main threat in the region. They believe the lobby was key in framing the Iran issue that way in Washington.
And briefly, Lebanon and Syria. Similar dynamics.
Pretty much. They argue the lobby's influence was visible in the strong U.S. backing for Israel during the 2006 war with Hezbollah, resisting calls for an early ceasefire. And on Syria, they say the lobby consistently pushed against diplomatic engagement with the Assad regime, favoring isolation and pressure, again reflecting Israeli preferences.
Which brings us to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself. What's the core argument about the lobby's impact there?
Their main point is that the lobby has been incredibly effective at preventing the U.S. from using its leverage, its aid, its diplomatic weight to really push for a settlement based on international consensus, meaning UN resolutions, ending the occupation, a two-state solution on the 67 lines.
So the U.S. talks about opposing settlements, for instance, but the aid keeps flowing and there's no real pressure.
That's exactly their point. They see a disconnect between stated U.S. policy and actual U.S. actions, and they attribute that disconnect to the lobby's ability to shield Israel from meaningful pressure. As we mentioned, they feel the U.S. often ends up acting like Israel's lawyer in negotiations.
Okay, so if the lobby is this influential, Mearsheimer and Walt argue it comes at a cost to the United States. What kinds of costs are they talking about?
They break it down into three main categories: strategic, economic, and moral.
Let's start with strategic.
Strategically, they argue that this unwavering, often unconditional support for Israel actually harms U.S. interests. They say it fuels anti-Americanism and terrorism, especially in the Arab and Muslim world. It complicates relationships with other allies in the region, makes it harder to solve other regional problems, and generally damages America's image and its soft power globally. They cite polling data and statements from figures like Osama bin Laden to back this up.
Okay, and economic costs.
The most direct cost is the foreign aid package itself, billions of dollars annually. But they also point to indirect costs: the burden of maintaining military superiority for Israel, potential impacts on oil prices due to regional instability linked to the conflict, and just the diversion of resources away from other needs.
And finally, the moral costs. This seems like a really central part of their critique.
It is. They argue that by supporting Israeli policies towards the Palestinians that many sees as violating international law or human rights, the occupation, settlements, the blockade of Gaza, demolition of homes, the separation barrier, the U.S. compromises its own stated values, and also by generally looking the other way on Israel's nuclear program. They feel it undermines America's moral standing and its ability to credibly advocate for human rights elsewhere.
So a pretty sweeping critique covering strategy, economics, and morals. Given all that, it's no surprise the book caused such a stir. What were the main criticisms leveled against it?
Well, as we noted, the charge of anti-Semitism was immediate and forceful. Many critics felt the focus on a Jewish lobby controlling foreign policy echoed dangerous historical tropes, regardless of the author's intentions.
Right.
There were also major methodological critiques. Some argued they overstated the lobby's influence, mistaking correlation for causation. Just because the lobby wanted something and it happened doesn't mean the lobby caused it.
Sure. Maybe U.S. and Israeli interests just genuinely aligned on that issue.
Exactly. Or critics said they cherry-picked evidence, ignoring instances where the lobby didn't get its way, like that Ava CS sale they eventually lost on.
How did Mearsheimer and Walt push back against those criticisms?
On anti-Semitism, they consistently fell back on their distinction. Criticizing a lobby isn't criticizing a people. They pointed to the non-Jewish elements of the lobby and framed it as standard political science analysis. On methodology, they defended their research, pointed to their extensive footnotes, and argued that while the lobby doesn't win every single time, its overall track record of influence is undeniable and shapes the general direction of policy. They argued that counterexamples were exceptions proving the rule.
And what about those alternative explanations, genuine shared interests, shared values? Critics must have emphasized those.
Absolutely. Many argued that the deep U.S.-Israel relationship is perfectly understandable based on genuine strategic alignment in a dangerous region, plus shared democratic values, a sort of natural alliance. Mearsheimer and Walt acknowledge those factors play some role, but they argue they just don't explain the sheer level and consistency of U.S. support, especially when that support seems to conflict with other U.S. interests or values. They also point to polls suggesting the American public often favors a more even-handed approach than U.S. policy reflects.
So, based on their analysis of the lobby's influence and the costs involved, what do Mearsheimer and Walt recommend the U.S. should do differently?
Their core recommendation is for the U.S. to adopt a more normal relationship with Israel, not abandoning Israel, they stress, but treating it more like any other close ally where support isn't unconditional. This means being willing to use U.S. leverage, including aid, to influence Israeli policy, particularly pushing hard for a two-state solution based on international law.
So more conditionality, more pressure when policies diverge.
Yes. And also engaging diplomatically with all regional players and, crucially, encouraging a more open and honest debate about U.S. policy towards Israel within the United States itself, free from accusations of anti-Semitism just for raising critical questions.
And they argue this shift would actually be better for everyone involved, including Israel in the long run.
That's their claim. They suggest that unconditional U.S. support allows Israel to pursue policies like settlement expansion, that are ultimately self-destructive and undermine its own long-term security and democratic character. A more normal relationship, they argue, would better serve both U.S. and Israeli interests.
Looking back now, years after its publication, what's the book's lasting impact? Did it change anything?
Well, it's definitely still controversial. Many of its claims are fiercely debated. U.S. policy itself hasn't fundamentally changed in the ways they recommended, but its impact was more in sort of cracking open the conversation. It brought arguments that were previously on the fringes into the mainstream academic and policy debate.
Right. It made it harder to ignore the role of domestic lobbying in this specific foreign policy area.
Exactly. It forced people to grapple with the argument, even if they disagreed. It sparked a lot more research on ethnic lobbies and foreign policy. And while policy didn't change overnight, you could argue it contributed to a gradually widening range of acceptable discourse on Israel-Palestine in the U.S.
If you had to quickly sum up its main strengths and weaknesses.
Strengths. It's systematic, very detailed with its case studies. It boldly challenges conventional thinking, and it tackles a really taboo subject head-on: weaknesses. Maybe overstating the lobby's power or unity at times, sometimes blurring correlation and causation, using language that some found problematic despite intentions, and perhaps underplaying genuine Israeli security dilemmas.
So a really important book to engage with, even if you don't agree with all of its conclusions.
Definitely. A major contribution to the debate, forcing a harder look at how U.S. foreign policy gets made.
Well, that was a deep dive into the Israel Lobby and U.S. foreign policy. We've explored its core arguments, the evidence they used, and the significant controversy it generated.
It certainly offers a distinct and often debated lens on a really critical piece of American foreign policy.
Absolutely. To explore these arguments further and form your own conclusions, you should definitely grab a copy of the book. Check the link in the description. And if you found this exploration valuable, please subscribe to Books and Bytes for more in-depth analyses of impactful works like this one.